My name is Zenobia Harris, and I'm the CEO of the Kent Chamber. So on behalf of myself and the board and my staff, we'd like to welcome you to our monthly luncheon. Today we also have our co-chair, Carmen Goers, here, who will be moderating the question and answer section of our session today. It is with great pleasure that I can introduce Peter Rogoff, who is the CEO of Sound Transit, and he'll begin his presentation today by telling us a little bit about himself and get into his presentation. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. A special thank you to assorted colleagues that I work with on a regular basis. Mayor Ralph is here, as well as a very treasured and very engaged Sound Transit board member, Dave Updegrove, your King County Council member. I didn't know I was supposed to say a few words about myself, but I will. And then really kind of get into the gist of the presentation. I'm also joined here by one of our outstanding South Sound Government Community Relations team members, Katie Drool. And are you going to advance slides, or I think probably you should.
I will. Yep, I got it.
Backwards. Great. A few things about myself. I've been in this position as Chief Executive Officer of Sound Transit since January of 2016. It was a very, very exciting time in that I had only been here a few months, and we celebrated a great milestone in March of 2016 of opening up the U-Link light rail extension, which, even though we only opened up 2 additional light rail stops, our light rail ridership grew between 60 and 70% overnight, just by reaching 2 of the biggest and most densely populated destinations in the state. So that was extremely exciting. Even more exciting was working with board members from across the 3-county region. And for those of you who may not know, Sound Transit is a regional authority that includes a taxing district that is the urbanized areas of King, Snohomish, and Pierce County, going from as far north as North Everett to as far south as Duval and as far east as Issaquah. So it is a regional body with 18 board members, of which Dave Updegrove is one, representing all 3 counties. And it is, I will say, as someone who's worked in the transit field and transportation field a good bit, a very high-functioning agency, both in terms of the commitment of the people that we have, as well as the involvement and engagement of our board members. Our 18 board members are made up of 17 elected officials like Dave Updegrove and the Secretary of Transportation for the state. So a little bit more about myself, and then we'll just thrust into it. Before I was here, I had 2 Senate-confirmed positions with the Obama administration. In the first term, I served as what's called the Federal Transit Administrator, where it's the job that oversees the federal agency that both regulates and funds public transit around the country. And then in the second term, I was the Undersecretary of Transportation, the number 3 person in the department, working with Secretary LaHood and then Secretary Fox on sort of all transportation issues, multimodal. My background was in transportation, having worked in transportation policy in the Senate for about 22 years. It's very exciting to be doing this stuff rather than just talking about it. And learning that I always said when I was in Washington, D.C. before I moved here, that you kind of know intellectually that it's a lot easier to talk about this stuff than to do it. And 3 1/3 years into this position, I could assure you that that has been proven true every day. But that's what makes it exciting, is you also get to actually kick the tires and see the fruits of all your work, rather than just glossy pamphlets that get mailed to Washington, D.C. So enough about me. Let's talk about what we're trying to do in this region. You want to go to the first slide? I mean, I'm going to state something that all of you know and experience every day, but it's worth repeating. This region is one of a select group of sort of 11 megaregions in the country that is growing and growing quickly and is scheduled to keep growing. And while that is exciting from an economic development and business opportunity perspective, it also brings with it the challenges of growth, and the one that we are obviously most fixated on is the challenge presented by road congestion. Tell you something else you already know, road congestion in this region has more than doubled in just 6 years. I'm not sure that there is another example around the country where the road network had reached saturation so quickly and then turned into, an environment where you could pretty much get anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes. And now some of those commutes, those old 40-minute commutes, could be 90 minutes on a good day. The other thing about road congestion in the region, which you all know, is it's some of the most unpredictable road congestion, because certain roads will move at certain hours of the days and then be at a dead stop the same hour of the day the next day. So what our mission is at Sound Transit is to give people an option of getting out of it. You will not hear me say that we're going to eliminate or even decrease congestion. Because the reality is, all the census data shows that 1 million more people are coming. We've already had like 200,000 additional population since 2015, but it's expected that we'll have 1 million more people in the region by 2040, and more recent data shows that 1.5 million more people by 2050. So that 2040 figure is equivalent to taking the entire population of Seattle and the entire population of Tacoma, adding it together and leveling it on top of the congestion and density we already have. And that's what we're expected to have by 2040. So we get very excited about giving people an options of getting out of congestion. It's not just getting out of the congestion that we're facing today, which is punishing enough. It's going to be the congestion that's going to actually get worse as the years progress. So some people sometimes turn to us and say, well, from Seattle, it still takes too long to get to the airport. Why don't you have an express train? And unfortunately, my answer sometimes is, it may not make sense to you right now, but it will in 5 years. And that is some of the, I don't want to be Debbie Downer here and not be chamber lunch, but that is the reality that we're dealing with. Dave is now bemoaning the fact that he sat with me. It's like he's want to be associated with me for lunch. So a lot of you, I think, are familiar with our current service, but it's just going to get better for the whole region. It's going to get particularly better for the city of Kent. We currently have 13 round trips to Seattle on our Sounder South trains, and as I'll be explaining when we get into it, Sounder South is a business that is doing extremely well. Our light rail runs from the university all the way through downtown Seattle onto down to Angle Lake, one stop south of the airport, but very importantly, we will be expanding it, and we are funded to expand it further south through Kent, onto Federal Way, and onto Tacoma. We are funded to fund it through north. We'll open it to Northgate in 2021. If any of you have been up by I-5 near Northgate, you nearly only just look at the mall and see all the construction that's ongoing. We are already funded with a federal grant and local dollars to get all the way up to Linwood, and we're scheduled to get all the way up to Everett. Eventually, we'll build out a full 116-mile light rail network to augment what we already do in commuter rail. And that is on a par, is actually slightly longer than like the entire Washington metro system. The other thing that we don't talk about a lot, because rail tends to be the shiny object that people want to fixate on, but we are actually the largest and busiest commuter bus operator in the United States. Commuter bus defined as bus service from the suburb or outer city, either between cities or suburb to center city. Obviously, the goal in part is to continue that bus service, but also convert some of that bus service to rail service when the rail service is extended and comes online. So let me go to the next slide. So what are we about the business of doing? Well, we're expanding in a great many ways. The first and sort of the most excited I'm going to talk about is our light rail extension onto Federal Way, because that has not one but 2 additional rail stations in Kent, at Kent Des Moines, and then at the Starlake Park and Ride right at the Kent Federal Way border. It is, if past is prologue on our rail extensions, people ask me sometimes what are the things that keep me up at night. Having seen what happened when we opened 2 stations at Yuling, some of the things that keep me up at night are whether we're going to have enough rail cars and whether we underestimated the folks that are going to flock to the service. Because as congestion worsens, the value proposition of actually just jumping on a train with your laptop or your book or a nap really kind of grows for folks. And we are seeing that specifically in the South Sound now, as I'll explain when I get to discussion on Sounder. But just like last year, where we were able to obtain a $1.2 billion federal grant to pay for about a little bit more than a third of the cost to get up to Linwood. We are currently seeking a 25% federal grant to help us pay the cost of getting down to Federal Way. And we did get some very good news on that just a few weeks ago. We were, I won't get into the federal bureaucratic weeds, but there's a thing called engineering authority where the federal government advances you to the next stage, starts taking paperwork on that grant, and signals a very positive viewpoint. The fact that we are only seeking 25% federal share for that project actually has us competing very well. I'll be honest, at the very beginning of the Trump administration, they had some very negative soundings toward partnering with folks, and they zeroed out these kinds of projects in the budget. There aren't too many things in Congress these days that unites Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate. But one of the things that did unite them on a bipartisan and bicameral basis was their opposition to that proposal. And as a result, the administration is now requesting money in its budget for these expansions and have in fact identified us in some of their paperwork as one that they think is meritorious because we're only seeking 25% federal funds. So we are optimistic, though it takes a lot of work and a lot of diligence. And I should point out both senators, Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell, and as well as Congressman Adam Smith, has been great allies in pressing for us to obtain this funding so we can stay on schedule and stay on budget and get this project done and have it open by 2024. And I think once we do, you're going to start seeing things change rather rapidly. I'll give you an example. I don't know if any of you have been to the east side recently, but in Bellevue, where we are going to open Eastlink in 2023, the year before we deliver Federal Way in 2024, we're going to open 10 stations overnight to the east side. And one of the most common, there's a lot of construction going on the east side right now for our light rail alignment, and one of the most common complaints we get is about construction noise. And 9 out of 10 times we have to say to them, thank you, we're concerned about the construction noise. You just need to understand that that noise is not coming from our project. It's coming from the new apartments or the new retail or all of the new facilities that are being built around our facilities by the private sector. So we will obviously attend to the construction noise when we're building through the city of Kent. We're also going to need to work in partnership with all the other building that will be going on that's going to accompany light rail when we get to the south. I will also say there will be parking. For that Federal Way extension between the stations that we'll be building, there'll be parking facilities that will together provide another 2,000 parking stalls. In some people's views, that is never enough. But the other thing to keep in mind, and I think Mayor Ralph has actually been very engaged with King County and King County Metro on this, when we build light rail out to a new community, one of the things that we do is we partner with King County Metro and other providers to make sure that there's bus service in. So when we extended light rail up to the university, King County Metro redeployed a whole bunch of routes and had a fairly major service change that allowed people to bus right into the UW station, descend the escalators and get on light rail and get downtown a lot more quickly. You'll see the same thing when we get down to Federal Way and here in Kent, where the King County Metro route structure will adjust itself to feed people into the light rail stations where they are. And we partner with, and the mayor was very engaged in this, in making sure that there will be adequate parking, turnaround space, and availability of space to ensure that that system's going to work. On the topic of parking, we can go to the next slide. We are building new parking, and there's new funded parking processes for our sounder stations, both in Puyallup, Sumner, Auburn, and of course here in Kent. I talked about South Sounder. Ridership is really booming in terms of sounder service from the south. We're up to about 16,500 riders a day. I describe it as, frankly, in some ways, especially when you're even farther south in Kent, the best deal we have going, because for like $5.75, you can get on in Sumner or Puyallup or Auburn or Kent, or it's even cheaper. And, especially the ones farther south, avoid 167 entirely, avoid 405 and 5 entirely, and have a very reliable ride. Our things that keep me up at night, knowing that we have enough rail cars to actually meet the demand that's going to be coming if it continues to grow in Sounder South. We've got this expanded parking that is coming, and all of it will come online by 2023. It'll be staged over different years. On Sounder South capacity, we also had in the ST3 ballot measure a very, very sizable chunk of money to try to expand the available number of trains and the capacity of the service. So, as you know, or you may know, this is not a railroad we own or a railroad we control or a railroad we dispatch. We run on Burlington Northern Santa Fe's freight main line. And it is a great challenge to make sure that all of the freight can continue to move and the Port of Tacoma and the Port of Seattle is well served by that freight when you also have to commingle with passenger trains. So we pay BNSF handsomely to run over that track. And we will be entering into a new negotiation with them that's really all built around seeing to it that we can increase the frequencies of Sounder. So that's the concern or complaint that we hear most from Sounder South riders. Well, gee, it would be great if we could leave a little bit later in the morning. Well, gee, it would be great if we could stay in town and meet a friend for a drink and or have dinner with my spouse and then be able to ride home later, like the commuter rail lines that run all day in other regional hubs in America. And another one that I totally associate myself with, my kids are all in college now, but back in the day when you had to be mindful of your ability to get home in the middle of the day as a parent or for any other reason, or as a child of an elderly parent. The fact that we don't have good frequencies in the middle of the day really undermines the potential of Sounder South. So we reserved a good chunk of money in the Sound Transit 3 ballot measure to have a conversation with BNSF about what is the art of the possible. One thing we are certain, I shouldn't say certain, but almost guaranteed to do, is we can expand from 7-car trains to 10-car trains, and frankly, we don't have to ask BNSF's permission to do that. And that is one of the immediate ways where we can grow capacity over the existing trains to make sure that we could serve the people who are riding it and serve them with seats, which if you ride Sounder South, especially if you're boarding in Kent, you're going to have some, when everyone else is boarded south of here, you could sometimes not get a seat. But the other thing we want to do is have the negotiation with BNSF about what infrastructure improvements we can make to deconflict the freight trains and the passenger trains so we can run more trains later in the day, earlier in the day, middle of the day. Our dream is to try to have hourly service. I don't know that that's really achievable, but to get more reliability on those trains. So we're looking at a range of investments and we're getting help, and we're getting help from the elected leaders throughout the region, and I want to thank especially Mayor Ralph, who is one of those elected leaders who's sitting on an advisory panel for us about what is the right mix of investments that we should be making over the next few years to best serve Sounder South customers. Also, the other major project we have, and you may have heard about it, is the need to locate an operations and maintenance facility in the South Corridor. So, operations and maintenance facilities are a necessary part of running a rail alignment, whether it's heavy rail, light rail, commuter rail. We need to have the ability to both service, clean, maintain, and do mechanical work on our light rail trains in order to keep them in service. We have one major operations and maintenance facility presently, but we're going from a system of a couple of dozen miles out to 116 miles. So we will eventually have 4. We have one right now in South Seattle. We have another one under construction in Bellevue on the east side. We need to locate one in the south in either the cities of Kent or Federal Way for reasons I can explain, and there'll be another one built up north. Often when you try to locate a maintenance facility, it is challenging. It's challenging for a number of reasons. One, people have an image in their head that a rail maintenance facility is something kind of noisy, loud, dirty, and an eyesore. And one of the things we do, which we did with Bellevue, and we actually did with Mayor Ralph and other elected leaders in Kent is to invite them to our current maintenance facility. We invite them to come at 2 in the morning, because that's when the facility is at its busiest, to actually see and hear and experience, well, how noisy is it really? How dirty is it really? How disturbing is it to the neighboring community? Mayor Ralph came. Strangely, she brought Dick's hamburgers when she did. I don't know if she was trying to send us a message or what. That was a little extra nutrition in the middle of the night. But it was a good opportunity to show elected leaders in Kent. The challenge is what we need is a very large chunk of acreage. And we need it to be flat, and we need it to be adjacent to our rail line. And when you have those imperatives, you don't have many choices. So we have explained to our board, and Dave Upgrove has been very involved in this discussion, there are no good choices. What we're looking for is the least bad choice. And we are currently in a process where we have completed the environmental scoping period. We've gotten a lot of comments into folks. Many people, obviously great fans of Dick's Drive-In, have weighed in. I have personally assured Jasmine, her dad, and others that this is not a vast vegan conspiracy, as has been asserted by some people. This is the challenge of trying to find a place where we could locate a suitable facility. There are 6 sites currently under consideration, 2 on or near the landfill, one that we call the Lowe's or Dick's Drive-In site. Other people are beginning to call it the Kent Des Moines TOD site, and there are also 1 in unincorporated King County and 2 in Federal Way. And coming this next coming month, we'll be making presentations to our board of directors about what we heard from the scoping process about each of those individual sites, and the board will then make a decision not on where to build a site. The board will only be making a decision on which sites to study in an environmental review process that will probably take another 18 months. But I would just emphasize that for all of the exciting things I said about having light rail expand to the region, getting people out of congestion, economic development that's going to happen around it, operations and maintenance facilities are a necessary part of that process, whether it's in the south, central, north, or east. And that is what we're about the business of doing. I think what I'd like to do is just sort of conclude there, because I'd love to hear people's questions if there are any. I just conclude by saying a few things. Boy, there's a lot coming for the region. And we actually are, we don't toot our horn very much, but this actually is the most ambitious transit expansion program in the United States right now. Los Angeles has also expanded very rapidly, but their ballot measure, which was larger than ours, actually had a large highway and local street component. But when you're looking at transit investments alone, we are the biggest node. We've got challenges. I was talking with folks from S&S Welding here. We have challenges, in fact, that construction costs in this whole region have been very, very high, just because we've got so much going on in such a hot construction market. It plays itself out in the pricing of the products we do. We also have a challenge because when we build these projects and procure property in order to build them on, we obviously have to pay, whether it's a residential owner or a business owner, fair market value for the property we take. And that property, for anyone who's bought or sold a house in this region in the last few years, knows how hot that market still is. So you'll read about cost growth in our projects, and that cost growth is principally about 2 things. How hot the construction market is, playing itself out into the pricing from our contractors, as well as the price of property we have to procure. So it isn't all a panacea. We have some headwinds to get all this done, but working with great partners, whether it's the City of Kent, the business community of Kent, our board members, Dave Upgrove most locally, we're going to deploy this very large, very ambitious program and actually give people a path out of congestion. So thanks for listening.
And I'll do a little shameless pandering at Peter's expense a little bit here. I'm one of the board members that when we get to our board meeting in May, feels that we don't need to advance all 6 sites into the environmental review process. I think the site in Kent, where the Dick's restaurant is located, is not an appropriate site to move forward because it's so close to the new light rail station that's being built. And as was talked about, Sound Transit is all about facilitating that development around the stations. The system works when you have high density transit oriented development around stations. So to me it doesn't make sense to build the operation and maintenance facility right next to a station where we want that kind of development. So I'll be advocating with my fellow board members at our board meeting to narrow down that list of 6 sites in such a way that does not include that particular site. And I don't know what the outcome will be. I think board members are going to be briefed on all the public feedback and we'll have a robust debate. But I wanted this community to know that I am supportive of narrowing that list down. And I don't believe that's an appropriate site. And I said some shameless pandering, I know, there. But I also am always willing to listen and sit down if folks ever have questions, and also happy if you don't know who in the agency to call and you have questions about Sound Transit, our office can help get you plugged in with the right people. We're lucky to have a strong leader at Sound Transit. Imagine overseeing a construction manager, being the construction manager of a project like this, with all of the political inputs, with all of the very challenging construction work to do. And we have a leader in our CEO, and Peter Rogoff, who takes the slings and arrows and helps guide us in a way that is very admirable, and we're lucky to have him. So thanks for having Peter and letting me say a few words too.
Thank you for that transition timing. Okay, Peter, there's a few questions, pretty much on the same topic. I'll switch sides with you. So, one, can you better describe what the development is? So some are thinking that it's possibly parking areas. You mentioned that it was the maintenance facility, but is it just a maintenance facility, or does it additional development beyond just maintenance?
No, good question. And I'll be honest, it can be whatever we want to imagine it to be. There are certain imperatives that we need in terms of rail turnarounds and bays in which we can do the actual maintenance, and there's generally what's called a car washer. It's like a car wash, it's just big because you have to roll a train through it. But I think one of the things I talked about, having people come up to our facility in the north, it's too early, but we got very imaginative, and we're rather proud about this, about what we were able to accomplish in Bellevue, because not surprisingly, you know, there wasn't a lot of things. I talked about a lot of things not unifying Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate. There wasn't a lot of things a few years ago that unified the Bellevue City Council, like their opposition to having a maintenance facility in Bellevue. It was maybe one of their only 7-0 votes that year. But interestingly enough, when we worked really carefully with the city on how to imagine how to make it work, how to do transit-oriented development around it, the agreements that we made to help facilitate the location of office facilities as part of all of their development in what they call the Bell Red Corridor, as Bellevue converts over to Redmond. There was then a 7-0 vote to approve the final plan. So it takes work, it takes cooperation, and in that particular case, for that particular community, what made sense was adjoining office facilities. But there's nothing that it need be beyond our core requirements of having rail turnaround facilities, maintenance bays, and other like the car wash. And then what you build around it and how you have that integrate can with some creativity, could actually be further innovative development.
Okay, let's go too far.
I'm not going.
Okay, so then we're going to talk about money.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you bring it?
I work for Heritage Bank. We sell it.
Oh.
We are a capitalist. You can bill me for that shameless plug as well. So when it comes down to financing it, how do you determine kind of who's going to pay for it? So ST3 kind of came out. We all got our car tab bills, and we're a little shocked by some of that. But then also, when you're doing ridership, you have a percentage of new riders and what they're going to pay. Does the ridership cost cover operational cost? How does that work in financing and maintaining light rail or Sound Transit? Excuse me.
No, good question. It doesn't pencil out at all. I mean, public transit is, by definition, in this country, it hasn't really been since the mid-'60s that a public transit agency has been able to run in the black. We are a subsidized enterprise with public dollars, your tax dollars, for a public purpose. So we don't come out this and say a particular set of riders needs to build a particular service. We have what we call, the board adopts this, a cost recovery goal, and each one of our services, whether it's our express bus service or our commuter rail service or our light rail service, has a different goal in terms of what percentage of its costs we try to recover through fares, and the rest is funded through tax dollars.
Okay.
So there's nothing about this facility, and we wouldn't have a different funding regime for this facility than we would have for any other, whether it was in Everett, Issaquah, or DuPont.
But the funding of it, so we have like our ST3, like there's tax funds.
And fair enough. So the cost of the project is embedded in the ST2 and ST3 ballot measures. Mm-hmm. We have a cost estimate of, which obviously is improved and refined as we get deeper and deeper into the engineering phases. And we bring those numbers to the board and ask the board to approve us to go to contract, just as we are doing so for the light rail extension to Federal Way. And I will say we're already about the business of planning the light rail extension from Federal Way down to Tacoma. So too will we bring contracts before the board out of available funds to pay for a maintenance facility. That will be true in the north as well as in the south. I think what we do have to do as an agency and as a fiduciary of taxpayer dollars is take a very hard look at at what pace do we commit ourselves toward projects based on how revenues are going and how costs are going. And these are some of the mind-numbing briefings that Dave has to sit through, where we go through and say, the real governing entity, the real where the rubber meets the road for us is our debt capacity, and we need to make sure, something you would certainly understand at the bank, how much debt we can take on as a public agency is set by law. So we have to be very mindful of what bills are going to occur, not just next year in the budget year, but when you're doing a multi-year commitment, you're going to, build a light rail extension, plan, design, and build it over as much as an 8-year period. You better be knowing that you're going to be able to cash flow it in years 6, 7, and 8. So we are constantly monitoring what our projections are for our cash needs, what revenues look like. And many of you will remember some really sad days when the recession hit in 2008 and 2009, and Sound Transit had to throttle back on a number of projects and say, we knew we were planning to deliver those in these dates, but we need to slow down until we know. So a number of these parking garages that I talked about, at least 2 of them, they were planned and then they were suspended until we knew we had the revenue, and then, we were able to go back to the board and say we can restart them now and deliver them because we know we'll have the cash, something we certainly did not know in 2009 when we were, when literally a third of our revenues disappeared with the worst recession since the Depression.
And thank you. Final question. How are you doing so far?
I'm fine.
All right. Okay. Feeling loved and welcomed by South King County? All right. Thank you very much. So, with technology going the way it is, are there thoughts or plans to change or implement underground transportation, autonomous vehicles in that light? How does new technology change future planning and what Sound Transit will do?
No, good. We get that question a lot, and I'm glad somebody asked it. I think we are always looking at new technology, and I'll be honest, one of the areas where we are sort of most interested in new technology is what kind of certainty can we give you about your commute by just looking at your phone? Because this is sort of some of the low-hanging fruit where, what you find with passengers is passengers are, by and large, understanding and resilient. They just want to know. And there's nothing that ticks a commuter off more than not knowing when they have a fighting shot at getting home. Are they calling my mother to pick up my kids, or am I going to get there in time, right? Those very real-life, daily things where if I had some better information, I could do some preventive maintenance. So, we periodically have issues. I talked about Sounder South, sharing track with BNSF. Well, what happens when one of those BNSF trains has a locomotive challenge and they have to service it for 22 minutes to get it back running and out of the way? The person in the Sounder train just wants to know, am I going to be 20 minutes late or am I going to be like 90 minutes late? And we are really looking at technology on how we could help people just be more predictive. Just as they'd love to know whether I-5 is going to run midday today or whether it's going to be at a dead stop midday today, so too, and we have some tools for that, we want to do that. On autonomous vehicles, I think there's a lot of excitement over the fact that we might get to autonomous vehicles, but I feel like I need to constantly remind people about a couple of things. One, it still needs to use a saturated road network. And while there may be some technologies, and I've been hearing about these technologies going back to the late 80s, where you can platoon vehicles and get more throughput for cars on the same highway, it's only going to make if we have 1.5 million more people coming by 2050, if that technology allows us to keep the status quo, that'd be great. But in the end, you're still dealing with a saturated road network and cars, be them autonomous or otherwise, that are running on a saturated road network. And there is no discussion here in this state that I've seen, even if you can get the permits and deal with the salmon culverts and every other issue, to actually expand the road network in a way that would actually move the needle on that challenge. The other thing I think people need to understand about platooning, which is what that is called when you move the vehicles simultaneously, it really only works when every car, you get the maximum benefit out of it when every car on the road has that technology and is wired. Who's buying everyone a new autonomous car? So currently, we are at an all-time record on how long people keep their cars. And that's in part a testament to the automotive industry that is making more reliable cars. But when you talk about having to turn over an entire fleet of cars such that there's a fighting chance that all the cars on the road will have a new technology installed, you're talking about a 20 to 22-year-old iteration of getting old cars off and new cars on. You're either going to have to wait till that technology is so universally deployed, and we're still a long way away from deploying it. What a lot of the experiments you hear about, both successful and unsuccessful, are about moving one autonomous car in an environment where other cars are not wired, but that's just one car. Either that, or one of the things I've heard proposed, which I think is not going to sell well with anybody, and that is we're going to have lanes and designated highway lanes for autonomous cars, and everyone else will be in the slow lane. So if you want to hear a debate over variable tolling on 405, that'll be nothing compared to when we have, take existing highway lanes and say, well, if you can afford a $60,000 autonomous car, you're good. And everyone else gets to compress into the other lane. So I'm not saying this because I'm in the transit industry. I'm saying this like the panacea is not around the corner. It's a long way away.
Well, Peter, you said the foul language word here, the T word, totally. We're going to have to get you an escort to the building.
I said it was a tough debate.
It's a tough debate. Well, on behalf of the Chamber and the Government Affairs Center, I want to thank you for coming up and speaking on this topic. If there's any additional questions, will you be after a little while.
I have to be honest, we have a committee meeting starting at 1 that I'm already going to be late for, so I'm going to bolt if I can. But listen, Katie Drool is here. You should submit any questions you have to us through the chamber on email, and we'll answer all of them, I promise.
So if I didn't summarize your question condensedly in that time, please do that.
Great.
Thank you. And Zenobia, please come back.